Head back out to Dubbo and catch up with the New South Wales Deputy Premier, Nationals leader John Barilaro. Thanks for joining us, John. You're very worried about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan because New South Wales is supposed to give up more water at the height of this drought for environmental flows. I suppose a plan like this, though, it only matters when water's scarce. It's easy to give up water when there's plenty around.
Well, I think that's at the heart of where we see a failing in the plan. There's got to be some flexibility in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan to deal with what is now a really tough period for regional rural New South Wales. It's not like we just hit 6 months into a drought. For some corners of this state, we're 3 or 4 years into a drought. We're watching water go past the front of the farm gate, heading down to South Australia into the lower lakes, which once upon a time was a saltwater lake. South Australia seems to have an abundant amount of water at the moment, and we take water away from irrigators, we take water away from communities, yet we don't take any water away from environmental flows. If we are in drought and there's a lack of water, it should be shared across the board, but there's just no flexibility, and we're going to fight for Team New South Wales. My line is simple: we just have no more water to give.
Well, when are you due to give this water? What if you were to do what the Basin Plan demanded of you, when would you be allowing this water to flow through, and where would it come from?
Well, under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, what we have to give up is 450 gigs, and that's permanently. This is not just a once-off, it's a permanent reduction in water for irrigators, and that's why through the investment of infrastructure to find more efficiencies in the system so that we have more water for the environment, or through buybacks is what's on the table. But for those that talk about buybacks, and every time you buy back water licences out of regional rural communities, you might take the water back from an irrigator and it goes back to the environment. But the reality is you're actually now losing jobs, killing industry, and that could be the end of a town. So for us, this isn't just about the now, it's about the future. And I actually look at it this way: this drought has actually highlighted the inflexibility and some of the faults within the Murray-Darling Basin Plan very early in its piece. We need a plan, I get that. We've got to manage water better, I accept that as well. But not when one state seems to do all the heavy lifting and other states are benefiting. And, if our concerns weren't real, then why would even Victoria sign up with New South Wales to have this review that was rejected? And we did ask the federal government at the last ministerial council meeting to deal with this, and they didn't, and nor did South Australia. So we went off with Victoria to review some of the issues, especially around constraints. And now, when that review gets back, that'll underpin what it looks like for New South Wales, and then we'll make a decision about where we stay, or if we stay or not in this plan, or what are the issues that we want resolved before we can continue on.
Doesn't there need to be a reassessment too of the environmental management? I mean, if there's allocations for environmental flows every year, it doesn't deal with the fact that obviously drought is a natural part of this country. The Murray-Darling system has experienced drought in the past naturally. In the years gone by, we know before all the locks and weirs and all our intervention, it's dried up. The Darling would dry up. Yet in a natural drought they're experiencing now, you're expected to allocate flows.
Chris, you couldn't have articulated any better. I mean, that is the key issue here. What we're saying is if irrigators can't access water because there's a lack of water, then why are we putting priority around environmental flows? In other words, intervening what is a natural phenomenon. And we're not doing that. We're intervening to make sure the environment doesn't miss out. But if you take man out of this, if you go pre-us, when droughts had come, those rivers would have run dry. There's nothing wrong with a drier riverbank, and when it rains, it'll fill up again. And yet, somehow, we've decided that man and intervention of government is at the priority in the focus of the environment. But that makes no sense. If you argue that in any pub right across regional rural New South Wales, they don't get it, and that's my point. The point is, you've got to build flexibility. Everyone has to share the pain, so that's the environment and the irrigators, and that would be a fairer system, and then we'll be able to actually get through this drought. But at the moment, zero allocation for so many irrigators, yet we've got a whole heap of water going down the river for environmental flows.
As a former South Australian, I'm well aware that about a decade ago, the last time we were facing some serious drought conditions, there was a lot of talk in South Australia about putting in a new weir at the bottom of the river to hold back fresh water and allowing those lower lakes to go back to their normal mix of a freshwater, saltwater, tidal basin. Do you think that that's something that needs to be examined if you're going to look at the proper management of the Murray-Darling Basin?
Yeah, absolutely. I've said it before. I think those barges have to be removed. The lower lakes were partly a saltwater lake, and yet again, we've intervened. We've intervened, and yet now the environmentalists out there would argue that we have to intervene. So really, their own argument in itself is the hypocrisy of this debate. The lower lakes were saltwater lakes at one stage, so let's remove all the barrages, let it become the natural lakes it is, and therefore not relying heavily on more inflows from New South Wales and north. So in my argument, I've said that consistently, that is something that should be back on the table. I know that's politically going to be a big fight, but what we want to make sure is that, here in New South Wales, we're not doing all the heavy lifting, that we're not destroying communities, we're not just destroying irrigators, and when we have genuine environmental flows, it's got to be in line with what else is happening in the environment and the landscape, and I don't think there's any of that. And there's got to be flexibility. This is an emergency. This is not a drought that's just been around for 6 months, as I said. This is a genuine emergency now, and when there are emergencies, when there are, of course, this level of impact on community, you've got to build flexibility, and so government can respond. At the moment, we haven't got to have any of that.
John, I've just got to get you again quickly on bushfires and climate change. You've got the Greens, Labor politicians, the public broadcaster, the ABC, pushing this nonsense somehow that they can pin the latest bushfires in New South Wales on climate change, and pretending that somehow climate policies in Australia can change the global climate and make us safer from bushfires. I mean, this nonsense has got to be called out, doesn't it?
Yeah, it has to be called out, and I know both the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister have called it out, and it continues. They're going to use a crisis, the fires in New South Wales and Queensland, to debate a political issue, which is climate change, and in itself that is something that is disgraceful on behalf of the Greens, and we all know, and if the impact of climate change, it's a gradual change in the climate. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't ignite fires, but we accept longer, drier periods of time mean the chance of fires will be increased. But the real issue here is
you could have a longer fire season.
The same people who are absolutely, but it's to do with fuel. When you talk about fires, you need of course ignition, and then you need fuel. And if it's drier periods, there you've got a greater chance for ignition. But the fuel load on the national parks forest floor, for instance, where the same group of people who fight for climate change don't allow for the hazard reduction for the burning of the forest fuel, and that's part of the biggest problem. And we'll see this. At the end of this fire season, we'll get to a chance to evaluate everything, and there is no question. If you talk to the RFS volunteers, they'll tell you about the amount of fuel that is on the forest floor, and that is something that we need to deal with, and we've got to stick ideology aside. But
I do have to cut you off there.
The Greens out there at the moment.
Sorry, John, I appreciate that. We do need to get to the break. Thanks very much for joining us. John Barilaro.